She went for a morning run and never came back, a marriage that hid a brutal truth. The morning she never returned. On the morning of Saturday, October 28, 2017, nothing about the Deval household suggested that this day would end in tragedy. The sun rose quietly over the small town of Gray. The streets were calm, the wooded trails still damp from the night air. Inside a renovated family home, Alexia Deval, 29 years old, prepared for her usual morning run. Running wasn't a hobby for Alexia, it was part of her identity. She trained regularly, followed strict routines, and knew every bend and incline of the nearby forest paths. Alexia came from a family that valued discipline and public service. She had been raised to believe in effort, integrity, and responsibility. Those who knew her described her as energetic but grounded, ambitious but loyal. She didn't disappear without warning. She didn't break routines. And she didn't take unnecessary risks. That morning, she dressed in her running clothes, stepped outside, and began a route she had taken dozens, if not hundreds, of times before. She never came back. Hours passed. By lunchtime, concern began to grow. Alexia's runs rarely lasted more than an hour and a half. Her phone remained unanswered. Calls went straight to voicemail. The house phone rang endlessly. There was no message. No explanation. Her husband, Jonathan Deval, tried to convince himself that nothing was wrong. He later told police that he had gone to work that morning, carrying on with his day as usual. To colleagues, he appeared calm, focused, ordinary. But by the early afternoon, unease turned into fear. Jonathan reached out to family members. The first call went to Gregory, Alexia's brother-in-law. The words were simple but alarming: Alexia hadn't returned. No one could reach her. That was enough to set off alarms. Alexia was dependable, predictable. If she was late, she called. If plans changed, she explained. Her silence made no sense. Without waiting for authorities, Jonathan and Gregory began searching on their own. They drove the familiar jogging route, scanning road edges, wooded clearings, ditches, anywhere a runner might slip, fall, or get hurt. Jonathan kept calling her phone as they searched. Every call went unanswered. As daylight faded, the fear deepened. Hospitals were contacted. Emergency departments checked. No one matching Alexia's description had been admitted. There had been no reported accidents. No witnesses had come forward. By evening, hope began to collapse. Jonathan went to the police station and officially reported his wife missing. He described what she was wearing, the route she usually ran, the time she had left the house. One detail stood out immediately: Alexia hadn't taken her phone or identification with her. For investigators, that detail was troubling. In the hours that followed, police treated the case as a disappearance. They considered every possibility: an accident, a medical emergency, an encounter with a stranger. Voluntary disappearance was briefly mentioned, but quickly dismissed. Nothing in Alexia's behavior, history, or personality suggested she would simply vanish. There were no leads. No blood. No belongings. No witnesses. The town of Gray waited. Family members clung to fragile hope that she had gotten lost, injured, confused. That she would reappear embarrassed but alive. But as the night passed in silence, dread settled in. 2 days later, on Monday morning, that hope was shattered. In a secluded wooded area not far from town, a body was discovered. The location was hidden, uneven, and rarely visited, far from jogging paths or open trails. When officers arrived, they immediately knew something was wrong. The body had been partially concealed beneath branches and leaves. It was burned. Not completely, but enough to show intent. Forensic teams quickly confirmed what everyone feared. The remains belonged to Alexia Deval. She had been beaten, strangled, and then someone had tried to destroy the evidence. The discovery sent shockwaves through Gray. Violent crime of this nature was almost unheard of. The wooded area where she was found had long been considered safe. Families walked there. Women ran alone there. Children played nearby. Now, fear replaced familiarity. Rumors spread quickly. Was it a random attack? A predator hiding in the forest? A stranger passing through? Social media exploded with theories. Parents warned their children. Runners stopped going out alone. But investigators noticed something else, something quieter, more unsettling. The fire. This wasn't panic. It wasn't chaos. Someone had tried to erase what they had done. That detail changed everything. What had begun as a missing person case was now officially a homicide. And as investigators turned their attention inward, toward routines, relationships, and private lives, the focus slowly began to narrow. Because in crimes like this, the truth rarely hides in the forest. It hides much closer to home. The husband everyone trusted. In the days following the discovery of Alexia's body, the town of Gray existed in a state of suspended disbelief. Flowers appeared at street corners. Candles flickered beneath handwritten notes. People spoke in lowered voices, as though the tragedy itself might still be listening. Everywhere, the same question echoed quietly but relentlessly: who could have done this? At the center of the mourning stood Jonathan Deval. He was always there. At memorial gatherings, he stayed close to Alexia's parents. At vigils, he bowed his head, hands clasped, eyes red but dry. When journalists approached, he spoke softly about love, about loss, about a future that had been stolen. He described Alexia as his strength, his motivation, his reason. To the public, he looked exactly as a grieving husband should. Newspapers captured his image beside Alexia's family. Television broadcasts framed him as a man destroyed by tragedy. Many in the community felt sympathy for him, even admiration. Losing a wife in such a brutal way was unthinkable. Losing her so young was unbearable. And yet, behind the scenes, investigators were doing what they always do. They began with the people closest to the victim. Jonathan was interviewed multiple times. At first, his statements appeared consistent. He said Alexia left for her run around 9 a.m. He said he went to work later that morning. He said he knew nothing until she failed to return. But as detectives pressed for details, small cracks began to form. Timelines didn't align perfectly. The sequence of events shifted slightly from one retelling to another. Nothing dramatic, just enough to make investigators pause. They noticed Jonathan struggled to explain certain gaps in his day. He was vague where precision mattered most. Then there were the injuries. During one interview, officers observed scratches on his neck and chest. There were marks on his arms, some resembling bite wounds. When asked, Jonathan said they were the result of an argument with Alexia the night before her disappearance. He described it as brief, heated, but insignificant. A normal marital disagreement. Forensic specialists disagreed. The injuries suggested a physical struggle far more intense than Jonathan admitted. At the same time, investigators examined the couple's home. Nothing was overturned. No obvious signs of violence. But forensic work isn't about what stands out, it's about what quietly connects. In the wooded area where Alexia's body had been found, investigators recovered a bedsheet used to partially cover her remains. When analyzed, it matched a set from Jonathan and Alexia's bedroom. That discovery shifted the investigation dramatically. If the sheet came from the house, then Alexia hadn't been killed where she was found. Her body had been moved. Attention turned to Jonathan's vehicle. His company car was equipped with a GPS tracker, something Jonathan hadn't mentioned. The data showed that during the night Alexia disappeared, the car had been near the wooded area where her body was later discovered. Tire impressions at the scene matched the vehicle's tread pattern. Jonathan had initially insisted he hadn't used the car that night. The evidence said otherwise. Still, publicly, Jonathan maintained his role as the grieving husband. He attended every memorial, walked at the front of marches. During one silent procession, thousands followed him through the streets of Gray, holding white flowers and photos of Alexia. When he spoke at the end of the march, his words were broadcast across the country. He called Alexia his oxygen, his reason for living. Many watching believed every word. Investigators did not. As pressure mounted, Jonathan's behavior began to change. During interrogations, his confidence wavered. He became defensive, then evasive. When confronted with inconsistencies, he didn't correct them, he redirected them. And then came the accusation. Months after Alexia's death, Jonathan claimed that her brother-in-law, Gregory, was responsible. He went further, alleging that Alexia's parents and sister knew the truth and had helped cover it up. The claim stunned everyone. There was no evidence to support it. No motive. No forensic link. To investigators, it looked like desperation, a man attempting to shift the weight of suspicion away from himself. Psychological experts were brought in. Their assessments painted a troubling picture, a man who avoided confrontation publicly but suppressed intense emotions privately. Someone deeply insecure. Someone who needed control but lacked the tools to manage it. When pressure built, it didn't release, it exploded. Jonathan's statements became increasingly unstable. One moment, he denied everything. The next, he hinted at partial responsibility. Then he retracted it. Then blamed others again. Each version contradicted the last. Public perception shifted. The man once seen as the symbol of grief was now viewed with suspicion. Sympathy turned to unease. The question no one wanted to ask began to surface openly. What if the danger had never been in the forest at all? By the end of 2018, the evidence was closing in. The pressure became unbearable. Jonathan's defense was collapsing under the weight of facts he could no longer explain away. And finally, after months of denials, accusations, and contradictions, Jonathan did something no one expected. He confessed. But even that would not be the end. Because what he admitted next would reveal that Alexia's death was not a tragic accident. It was the result of deliberate violence. The confession that came too late. By the end of 2018, the case against Jonathan Deval had reached a breaking point. For more than a year, he had shifted between silence and accusation, denial and implication. Each version of events contradicted the last. Investigators had remained patient, methodical, allowing the evidence to speak louder than his words. And now, the evidence was overwhelming. Under mounting pressure, Jonathan finally admitted what he had spent months trying to escape. On November 23, 2018, he acknowledged that he had played a direct role in the death of his wife, Alexia Deval. According to his statement, the night before her disappearance, an argument had erupted inside their home. The subject, he claimed, was intimacy. Years of frustration, failed attempts to start a family, unspoken resentment, emotional distance, had boiled over. Voices were raised. Accusations were exchanged. Then, control was lost. Jonathan said the argument turned physical. He admitted that he placed his hands around Alexia's neck and strangled her. At first, he described it as a moment of panic, a sudden loss of control, something he never intended to go that far. But only days later, he reversed himself again. In court hearings that followed, Jonathan withdrew his confession and returned to his earlier claim that Alexia's brother-in-law was responsible. To Alexia's family, this reversal felt like cruelty layered on top of tragedy. Each change reopened wounds that had barely begun to close. Investigators were no longer swayed. They organized a direct confrontation between Jonathan and Alexia's family. During that meeting, Alexia's mother presented him with a photograph of her daughter. Faced with her image, Jonathan broke down. He stopped deflecting. He stopped blaming others. This time, he told the truth. In June 2019, during a court-ordered reconstruction of the crime, Jonathan retraced every step of that night. Investigators followed as he described the violence in detail, details he could not have known unless he had been there. He admitted to striking Alexia repeatedly in the face. 5 times. Maybe more. He admitted that after the beating, he strangled her with his hands until she stopped moving. Then came the part that erased any remaining doubt. Jonathan explained how, realizing she was dead, he made a series of deliberate decisions. He wrapped her body in a bedsheet from their home. He loaded her into his car. He drove into the woods outside Gray, to a place he knew was secluded. There, he tried to burn her body. Not in panic. Not in confusion. But to destroy evidence. Psychological experts later testified that Jonathan exhibited obsessive traits, a deep need for control, and an inability to handle emotional rejection. The strain of infertility, the imbalance in the relationship, and his suppressed resentment had created a volatile internal pressure. When it finally released, it was lethal. Jonathan's trial began in November 2020. Because of public health restrictions, the courtroom was altered, seating spaced apart, transparent barriers installed. But nothing could distance the jury from the weight of what they heard. Forensic experts described Alexia's injuries in clinical detail. Psychiatrists confirmed that Jonathan was fully aware of his actions and their consequences. He was not legally impaired. He knew exactly what he was doing. When Jonathan took the stand, he admitted that he understood Alexia would die when he tightened his grip around her neck. That single statement silenced the room. The defense argued that the killing was not premeditated, that it was the tragic outcome of a marital dispute. But the prosecution focused on what came afterward: the transportation of the body, the attempted burning, the repeated lies. Those were choices. Alexia's parents testified next. They didn't ask for vengeance. They asked for clarity. For truth. For an honest account of how their daughter's life had been taken. During the final hearing, Alexia's mother asked Jonathan once more to explain everything, step by step. He collapsed to his knees and asked for forgiveness, but offered nothing new. No deeper explanation. No final honesty. On November 21, 2020, the verdict was delivered. Jonathan Deval was found guilty of the intentional killing of his wife. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with a mandatory minimum before parole eligibility. He did not appeal. For the town of Gray, the verdict brought closure, but not peace. The danger had never been a stranger in the woods. It had been a man trusted, mourned, and defended. A reminder that sometimes, the most terrifying crimes don't come from the shadows. They come from inside the home.